Hello and welcome. This video is for Unit 2 GCSE Physics and it's called Static Electricity. Now static electricity, the word static actually means still. So we are dealing with electricity that in some way is still, and that's usually to do with insulating materials, for example plastics and those kinds of materials. Now one example of that happening is with a polythene rod. And polythene is just the kind of plastic. If it's rubbed by a dry cloth, what can happen is the rod can actually become electrically charged, as can the cloth. And what tends to happen is this scenario here. So if we look more closely at what's going on, the rod itself has atoms in it, and the atoms are with protons and electrons and neutrons. The protons and electrons balance each other out, so there's the same number of protons and electrons in the rod. So here you can see I've just tried to draw it by these circles. We've got 3 negatives, 3 positives, and it's all nicely balanced out. Same with the cloth. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 negatives and 5 positives, and at the moment it's all balanced out. Now what happens when you rub is that some of these electrons in certain conditions with certain materials can actually be transferred. So the example of polythene, the electrons can actually rub off onto the polythene rod. Now what that then leaves us with is an imbalance of electrons and protons. Here we can see we've got 6 electrons and 3 protons, so there's an overall negative charge on this rod. The cloth is left with more positives than negatives, and therefore the overall charge on the cloth will be positive. Now this doesn't always happen this way around. If you take another kind of material, for example perspex, with perspex it happens the other way around. So you can rub your cloth on the perspex, and instead of the electrons moving from the cloth to the perspex rod, they move the other way. So the electrons move onto the cloth. So what you're then left with is a cloth that has an overall negative charge, and the rod which has an overall positive charge, because there are more positive charges on those protons in the atoms of the substance called perspex. Now you don't need to memorize which kind of material will gain or lose electrons. What you need to be aware of is the fact that electrons can move, and the substance that the electrons move onto becomes negatively charged, and the substance that the electrons move away from becomes positively charged. Okay, and at the moment here we have that scenario described. Now if we were to take those rods after we've charged them as just described, we could actually do a little experiment and bring them near each other and see what would happen. So in this scenario here, if I brought these 2 rods together, one that's positively charged and one that's negatively charged, they would attract, because positive and negative attract. Now if I was to hold this in my hand and then try and see that attraction, I probably wouldn't feel it very much because it's not a huge amount of attraction. But what you can do is actually just dangle one of the rods from a string, and you can bring the other rod nearby and see what happens. So in this scenario here we would have the rods attracting, so you could bring that nearby and that rod would actually move and attract to that one. Not a great way of animating that, but you understand what I mean. Okay, so another scenario could be that you have your positive rod, and if you brought your other negative, again you'd get attraction. But if you brought the 2 positives together, then we would get what we call repulsion, or the 2 rods would repel, so that would actually move in the other direction. It would